In the early years of the Second World War, the Atlantic Ocean became a graveyard. It was not the kind marked with stone crosses or carved names. It was a silent one, vast and cold, where the only memorials were oil slicks drifting on black waves and the sound of ship hulls cracking under pressure as they slipped beneath the surface. Between 1939 and 1942, the Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. They were not simply losing it in numbers, they were losing it in spirit. Merchant sailors crossed the ocean knowing that at any moment a torpedo could strike without warning. Convoy commanders prayed for escort ships that often arrived too late. Families scanned newspapers whose casualty lists grew longer each week. And across the sea, German U-boat crews believed that the Atlantic belonged to them entirely. They called their hunting ground the Black Pit, a vast central region of the ocean that no aircraft could reach. In this dark domain, U-boats attacked convoys with almost complete impunity. The statistics were horrifying. In 1942 alone, the Allies lost more than 6 million tons of shipping. Entire convoys were torn apart in a single night. Tankers exploded in fireballs so bright that other ships were silhouetted and became targets themselves. Lifeboats drifted for days before capsizing in rough seas. The U-boat commanders, skilled and relentless, moved through the Atlantic like predators in a silent forest. They attacked at night, surfaced to recharge batteries, and slipped away before escorts could react. The Allies tried every conventional strategy. More destroyers were deployed. More convoy routes were adjusted. More patrol aircraft were sent out from Newfoundland and Iceland. But no matter what they tried, there remained that deadly gap, the deep center of the Atlantic where aircraft could not fly far enough to protect the ships. It was in that gap that the U-boats hunted most effectively. Convoys feared the moment they entered it. Radio operators knew that as soon as their frequencies were triangulated, wolf packs would converge. Across the bridge windows of those slow-moving ships, every white cap looked like a periscope. Every shimmer on the surface looked like a torpedo wake. The ocean felt haunted. The situation grew desperate. Prime Minister Churchill admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him. American commanders were equally alarmed. Supplies to Britain were falling dangerously low. Steel, food, ammunition, aviation fuel, spare parts, trucks, artillery pieces, clothing for soldiers, everything moved across that single ocean. Without the convoys, Britain would collapse. Without Britain, the United States would lose its most important staging ground for the coming liberation of Europe. Something had to change. But the Allies had no weapon capable of closing the gap. Long-range aircraft like the B-24 Liberator existed, but only in small numbers. Destroyers and corvettes were too slow to chase U-boats once they submerged. And the idea of sending fleet carriers into the Atlantic was unthinkable. They were too valuable, too large, and too vulnerable to the unpredictable storms and narrow convoy lanes. What the Allies needed was something entirely new. A ship small enough to sail with convoys, cheap enough to build in numbers, tough enough to survive the Atlantic, and capable of launching aircraft far out into the ocean. The answer arrived not with a roar, but with a humble silhouette. USS Bogue, CVE-9. She did not look like a ship destined to change the course of the war. The escort carriers were small, almost awkward in design, with short flight decks and modest speed. They carried a handful of Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers, nothing compared to the air groups aboard the Great Pacific carriers. Their hulls had merchant ship origins. Their engines were slow. Their appearance, unimpressive. But they had something more important than size. They had range. They had endurance. They had the ability to bring the sky into the center of the Atlantic where no aircraft had been able to fly before. At first, even the sailors assigned to Bogue were unsure what to expect.
They looked at the squat hull and wondered if such a ship could stand against the vicious storms that hammered the Northern Ocean. They looked at the small air group and wondered whether a handful of aircraft could truly turn the tide against the wolf packs that operated in coordinated swarms. They looked at the new doctrine being written around them and realized that they were about to attempt something no navy in history had done. They were not escorting convoys. They were hunting the hunters. When Bogue sailed on her first missions, the mood aboard was tense but determined. The sailors felt the weight of the Atlantic's dead behind them. The air ring trained relentlessly, practicing launch and recovery in rough seas. The destroyers and destroyer escorts assigned to her group drilled in anti-submarine tactics day and night. Radio operators learned to use high-frequency direction finding equipment. Pilots learned how to spot subtle signs on the water that might reveal a submerged submarine. A faint swirl, a thin wake, a momentary glint of metal. The Atlantic had always belonged to the U-boats. For the first time, it would have predators of its own. Bogue's officers understood the significance of what they were doing. Without victory in the Atlantic, there could be no war in Europe. No Operation Torch, no Sicily, no Salerno, no D-Day. Everything depended on stopping the U-boats. And so, in the winter of 1943, with the wind cutting across her deck and her aircraft secured against the spray, USS Bogue turned her bow toward the Black Pit. The ocean ahead was filled with shadows, but for the first time in years, the shadows would learn to fear what hunted them.
By the beginning of 1943, the Allied command understood one thing with absolute clarity. The traditional way of fighting the U-boats was not enough. Destroyers could react, but they could not search. Patrol aircraft could search, but they could not reach the Black Pit. Convoys could defend themselves, but they could never go on the offensive. The only way to break the grip of the U-boat menace was to change the very nature of the war itself. USS Bogue became the instrument of that transformation. When she sailed into the mid-Atlantic early that year, she did so not as a simple escort carrier, but as the centerpiece of a new kind of fighting formation. It was called a hunter-killer group. For the first time, the Allies created a task force designed not to run from U-boats, not to hide from them, and not to wait for attacks, but to actively search for submarines and destroy them wherever they were found. This was a revolutionary idea. Until then, the Atlantic War had been defined by defense. Convoys were shielded, not armed. Escorts reacted to wolf pack attacks, often in darkness and confusion. But a hunter-killer group flipped the equation. With Bogue at its center, the Allies intended to turn the predators into prey. The group assigned to her typically included a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts, fast, maneuverable ships equipped with sonar, depth charges, and later Hedgehog mortars. They fanned out around the carrier in a protective circle, but their purpose was not simply to defend her. Their job was to attack once Bogue's aircraft found a target. And that was the heart of the new strategy: aircraft. Aircraft could search an enormous area, far beyond the range of sonar on destroyers. Aircraft could appear suddenly above a periscope, forcing the U-boat to dive before it could attack. Aircraft could loiter above patches of ocean until the submarine was forced to surface to recharge batteries. Bogue's flight deck, short and narrow, seemed an unlikely place to stage these operations. But her air group trained relentlessly. Wildcats practiced long patrol arcs, flying low over the water with their shadows stretching across the waves as they hunted for subtle signals of a submarine below. Avengers practiced depth charge runs, engines roaring as they swept in low to release their payloads at precise angles. The pilots learned what to look for: a small shimmer in the water, a faint wake that should not be there, a patch of discolored sea where a submarine had recently submerged, a periscope slicing briefly above the surface like a needle through cloth.
The crew learned to trust their instincts in the vast emptiness of the Atlantic. Many attacks began not with clear radar hits or radio intercepts, but with a feeling something did not look right on the surface below. To support these aircraft, Bogue relied on new technology that was just beginning to alter naval warfare. High-frequency direction-finding equipment, known as HFDF or HFDUF, allowed radio operators to pinpoint U-boat transmissions in real time. When German submarines sent messages to coordinate Wolfpack attacks, the operators aboard Bogue triangulated their general location. A bearing pointed out to sea. A distance could be estimated. Then the order was given: launch aircraft. The deck crews moved with speed and precision even when the ocean rose beneath their feet. They pushed the Wildcats forward, wings locked in place, engines churning spray as they rolled into the wind. Avengers followed, heavy with depth charges and later with acoustic torpedoes. Each launch was a gamble in the unpredictable Atlantic wind, but every successful takeoff increased the area the group could search. Once airborne, the aircraft fanned out in wide patterns. Pilots scanned the dark blue water below, searching for the slightest hint of movement. Some flights saw nothing for hours. Others returned with news that would electrify the entire fleet. At first contact with the U-boat, the pilots reacted instantly. The submarine always attempted to dive. The pilot dropped smoke or markers. The destroyers changed course immediately, engines roaring as they raced toward the location. The entire hunter-killer group shifted into attack mode in seconds. It was a far cry from the early years of the war, when convoys often had to wait helplessly as U-boats disappeared beneath them. Bogue's air patrols made the ocean small. One by one, U-boats that had stalked convoys with confidence found themselves staring upward through their periscopes at the silhouettes of wildcats circling above them. They knew they had been found. They knew they had seconds to act. Some attempted crash dives, some launched decoys, others fought back with gunfire when caught on the surface. But the presence of aircraft in the Black Pit changed everything. For the first time, the U-boats were hunted even in the vast center of the ocean. This transformation was so dramatic that German commanders were forced to rewrite their doctrine. No longer could U-boats rise to the surface in daylight. No longer could they coordinate Wolfpack movements with impunity. No longer could they wait calmly for convoys to enter the kill zone. Every time they surfaced, every time they transmitted, every time they raised a periscope, they risked attracting the attention of Bogue and her hunters. Within weeks of the first patrols, U-boat crews began reporting aircraft sightings in areas where they believed themselves safe. The reports were filled with disbelief and fear. They asked how aircraft could have reached them. They asked where the Americans were launching these planes. The answer was simple. They were launching them from a small escort carrier that had turned the rules of the Atlantic War upside down. By spring of 1943, Bogue had proven the concept beyond doubt. The hunter-killer group worked. It worked better than anyone dared hope. And soon, the submarine commanders of the Kriegsmarine would learn just how deadly this new weapon truly was. The killing season was about to begin.
By mid-1943, the Atlantic no longer belonged to the wolves. It belonged to the hunters. And leading those hunters was a ship no German admiral had feared at the start of the war, a small escort carrier with a short flight deck and a modest air group. USS Bogue was never meant to be a symbol of power. Yet, by the summer of 1943, her name carried weight in German signals traffic. U-boat captains whispered about her. Kriegsmarine intelligence officers tracked her movements with urgency. And the term Bogue Group began appearing in reports with the same anxiety once reserved for destroyer flotillas. Her transformation into a nightmare for submarine crews began quietly. During one of her early hunter-killer patrols, a wildcat flying in rough weather spotted a periscope wake slicing across the gray surface of the ocean. The pilot dove instantly, closing the distance before the U-boat could react. In the cockpit, the pilot watched as the submarine tried to crash dive, its bow sinking beneath the waves. He marked the spot with dye and radioed the coordinates. Minutes later, a destroyer Escort roared toward the scene. Sonar operators leaned in close to their headsets. A faint echo appeared. Depth charges rolled off the stern, plunging into the deep. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then a dull thud traveled up through the water, followed by a shuddering blast. Oil and debris rose to the surface. It was the first U-boat kill credited to the Bogue group. It would not be the last. In the months that followed, the hunting intensified. Bogue's Avengers became masters of the deep. Armed with depth charges and later with the new phytoacoustic torpedoes, they struck U-boats at their weakest moment, the instant they surfaced, or the instant they dove. The pilots learned to attack with ruthless precision. Avengers swooped down low, engines screaming, releasing depth charges in perfect patterns that boxed submarines in with walls of water and concussion. Each success emboldened the air wing. Each kill spread fear across the Kriegsmarine. The U-boats that once stalked convoys with confidence now felt hunted every time they approached the surface. One of the most famous engagements occurred when Bogue's aircraft detected U-217. The submarine had surfaced to recharge batteries under cloud cover, believing it was safe. But the Wildcat pilot who spotted it saw the faint gray shadow against the waves and dove without hesitation. The U-boat crew scrambled for their deck gun, firing desperately at the oncoming aircraft. The Avenger arrived seconds later. The pilot flew so low that the spray from the submarine's wake hid his windshield. He released a perfect string of depth charges just as U-217 began to slip beneath the waves. The explosion lifted the submarine out of the water. When the spray cleared, nothing remained but a spreading oil slick. Another day, an Avenger chased U-527, dropping depth charges that cracked its pressure hull. The submarine attempted to limp away underwater, but sonar from the destroyer George E. Badger tracked it relentlessly. More charges followed. The final blast broke U-527 open and sent it crashing to the bottom. U-613 followed soon after, then U-172, then U-86. Each kill spread shock across the U-boat arm. The U-boat captains began calling the escort carriers Skywolves. They wrote in war diaries that the Americans had taught the Atlantic to fly. Bogue's achievements were so significant that German high command took notice. Admiral Dönitz, once confident that his wolf packs would starve Britain into submission, began losing faith. The statistics were brutal. Before Bogue's group became operational, Allied merchant losses were catastrophic. Within 6 months of her hunter-killer missions, those losses dropped by more than 70%. It was one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of naval warfare. What had once been the hunting ground of the U-boats had become a killing field for the Allies. The Germans attempted to adapt. They equipped U-boats with snorkels to allow them to run submerged longer. They tried sailing in smaller groups. They altered radio doctrine to reduce transmissions. They modified torpedoes. But nothing worked. Bogue's aircraft had extended the reach of Allied detection far beyond anything the U-boats could counter. The submarines were forced to stay underwater for longer periods, reducing their speed, their range, and their ability to coordinate. They surfaced only at night, and even then, radar-equipped aircraft spotted them with ease. The ocean itself became hostile to them. Meanwhile, aboard Bogue, the mood shifted from cautious optimism to absolute confidence. The sailors believed they were part of something historic. The pilots believed that no submarine could escape them. The destroyer crews believed their sonar could outlast any evasive maneuver. Everything about the Bogue group worked. Everything frightened the enemy. Admiral King would later say that Bogue did more to win the Atlantic than any battleship in the fleet. It was not exaggeration. By the end of 1943, the U-boat threat had been broken, not eliminated, but broken. Without the ability to dominate the mid-Atlantic, Germany lost its grip on the lifeline feeding Britain and the Soviet Union. Tanks, fuel, aircraft, ammunition, supplies all flowed freely across the ocean again.
The killing season of the Bogue Group had saved the Atlantic, and the U-boats knew it. For the first time since the war began, the hunters were now the hunted, and the name every submarine commander feared most was not the name of a destroyer or a battleship. It was the name of a small escort carrier that had turned the tide of the war.
By early 1944, the Bogue Group no longer felt like an experiment. It felt like a force of nature. What had started as an innovative idea, a small escort carrier leading destroyers into the Black Pit, had become one of the most feared formations in the Atlantic. Allied commanders studied her methods. German commanders dreaded her appearance. Sailors aboard merchant ships whispered her name like a prayer, and every U-boat captain knew that if he surfaced and saw aircraft circling above, there was a good chance they had come from Bogue. The shift was so profound that the Germans had to rewrite their doctrines. For years, U-boats had hunted comfortably at night, rising to the surface to charge batteries, ventilate the boat, and coordinate wolfpack attacks. But Bogue's aircraft were not limited by daylight. Radar-equipped Wildcats and Avengers could find a submarine in darkness as easily as they could in daylight. Once, a U-boat had only to fear the escorts near a convoy. Now it had to fear the sky itself. It was the sky that broke them. Aboard Bogue, pilots flew patrols in steady rotation, sweeping arcs across the ocean that reached farther than any surface vessel could. Their radar searched for periscopes and snorkels. Their eyes scanned for unnatural wakes. Their ears listened for coded transmissions intercepted by Bogue's HF-DF equipment. Every time a U-boat sent a signal to headquarters, a bearing appeared on Bogue's plotting table. It was not precise, but it was close enough. A destroyer would turn immediately. An Avenger would take off moments later. The U-boat operators had no idea how vulnerable they had become. One night in early 1944, U-575 surfaced to recharge its batteries. The crew believed they were safe. The sky was overcast, the sea was calm, there was no convoy nearby. Yet within minutes, a Wildcat appeared out of the darkness, dropping flares that illuminated the ocean in a ghostly glow. The submarine attempted a crash dive, but Avengers were already inbound. Depth charges exploded in a pattern so tight that the submarine was lifted from below. The pressure hull cracked. The sea poured in. The survivors who reached the surface clung to debris as the destroyer Hobson arrived. In debriefings later, they admitted they had never imagined aircraft could find them so far from any convoy. This happened again and again. Every time a U-boat captain raised a periscope, he risked being spotted. Every time he transmitted to coordinate a wolfpack, he risked drawing Avengers to his position. Every time he surfaced to recharge his batteries, he risked triggering a radar detection from miles away. The sea that had once hidden U-boats now betrayed them. The sky that had once been empty now carried hunters. German intelligence reports show an almost desperate shift in tone. U-boat crews complained that the Americans had wings everywhere. Some claimed that the Americans could see through clouds. Others believed aircraft were waiting for them beyond the horizon. One captain wrote in his log that he no longer feared destroyers or depth charges. He feared the sudden roar of an engine above him. The psychological effect was enormous. Bogue's greatest weapon was not the depth charge or the torpedo, it was fear. Fear forced U-boats to stay submerged for longer periods. This starved them of air and exhausted their batteries. A submerged U-boat moved only a fraction as fast as one on the surface, making it too slow to intercept convoys. Fear forced them to travel alone instead of in coordinated packs. This shattered the wolfpack strategy that had once devastated Allied shipping. Fear kept them from surfacing to scan with their optics, making them blind. Fear made them transmit less often, making them deaf to orders from headquarters. Fear made them surface only at night, and even then they were hunted by radar-equipped aircraft. Bogue had changed the entire psychology of submarine warfare. One German officer wrote after the war that the U-boat crews felt they were fighting ghosts in the sky. The Allies, for the first time in the Atlantic War, had overwhelming tactical initiative. While many escort carriers contributed to this transformation, Bogue stood out. She was the ship that proved the concept worked. She was the first to consistently hunt and destroy submarines deep in the ocean. She was the one that commanders cited in meetings, the one sailors admired from a distance, the one the enemy feared by name. Her successes became so significant that Admiral Ernest King declared Bogue did more to win the Atlantic than any battleship. Coming from a man known for blunt opinions and high standards, that statement carried enormous weight. Bogue's destroyers knew it. They followed her with fierce loyalty. Each time her aircraft found a target, they raced in with sonar and depth charges. Each time her planes attacked, the destroyers pressed so close to detonation patterns that their decks shook from underwater shock waves. Her air crews knew it. They landed on her short, heaving deck after hours of patrol, engines sputtering, fuel gauges near empty, exhausted, but triumphant. Her sailors knew it. They worked through storms, manned guns in rough seas, repaired aircraft damaged by violent Atlantic crosswinds, and listened to radio reports announcing another U-boat destroyed. By mid-1944, the Battle of the Atlantic was no longer a desperate fight for survival. It was a rout. The U-boat arm was collapsing, the wolf packs were scattered, the hunters had become the hunted. And at the center of this turning tide, cutting through the waves with a small flight deck and a relentless mission, was a ship that had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. A ship called USS Bogue.
By late 1944, the Atlantic no longer felt like the haunted graveyard it had been in the early years of the war. The desperate nights where convoys drifted helplessly through the black pit, listening for torpedoes in the dark, had given way to a new reality. The ocean, once ruled by U-boat wolf packs, was now patrolled by aircraft whose shadows stretched across the waves. And at the center of that transformation was a small escort carrier whose name echoed across the Allied navies and the Kriegsmarine alike. USS Bogue had done more than sink submarines. She had changed the entire nature of the war. She had proven that size did not define power, and that even a modest, slow merchant hull conversion could alter the fate of nations when paired with vision, technology, and relentless determination. As the war pushed into its final years, Bogue remained at the forefront of Atlantic operations. Her hunter-killer group continued patrolling the deep ocean, sweeping routes long considered too dangerous for any surface vessel. The convoys that once crept through the black pit now moved confidently, escorted by ships that no longer feared the silent approach of torpedoes. Allied supply lines surged to levels unimaginable in 1942. Fuel flowed, food flowed. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, machine tools, ammunition, steel, medical supplies, every resource required to sustain the Allied war machine crossed the Atlantic in numbers never seen before. And while many ships contributed to that achievement, Bogue's impact stood above the rest. Admiral Ernest King, a man not known for giving praise lightly, stated flatly that Bogue did more to win the Atlantic than any battleship. Coming from the head of the United States Navy, that was not a compliment, it was a verdict. By the time Germany began its final collapse in 1945, Bogue's hunter-killer group had destroyed more than a dozen U-boats and helped force countless others to remain submerged, powerless, and irrelevant. The U-boat arm, once Hitler's greatest weapon, had been broken. But numbers tell only part of the story. The greater legacy of Bogue was the change she sparked. Before her, convoy escort doctrine was defensive, reactive, and cautious. After her,
the Atlantic became the first ocean in history where submarines were hunted from the air, far beyond the reach of land-based patrols. Before her, small carriers were seen as an emergency measure. After her, they became indispensable tools of modern naval strategy. Before her, the Atlantic was a battlefield shaped by fear. After her, it was shaped by dominance. The Allies built more than 40 additional escort carriers following Bogue's example. They patrolled every convoy lane, hunted every wolfpack route, and covered every supply corridor between North America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Each of those ships was, in a way, a descendant of Bogue, a ship modeled on her success, guided by her doctrine, and inspired by her record. Sailors began referring to the phenomenon with a simple phrase: every convoy deserves a Bogue of its own. It was not official Navy doctrine. It was a belief born from experience. The men who served aboard her understood her significance better than anyone. They watched the ocean change beneath their feet. They saw fear replaced by confidence. They saw convoys reach port safely week after week. They saw the Atlantic, once deadly and unpredictable, become a controlled and guarded space. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, Bogue's deck crews stood quietly on the flight deck staring at the calm water stretching to the horizon. Many of them once believed they would cross the Atlantic only once. Others thought they might never see land again after their first U-boat encounter. But there they stood, aboard a ship that had defied every prediction and outperformed every expectation. Bogue was not flashy. She had no heavy armor. She had no massive gun turrets. She was not the pride of any fleet review. Yet she carried something more powerful than all of that. She carried purpose. She carried a mission that mattered more than glory. Her legacy lived on long after she sailed her last patrol. Naval historians wrote about her impact. Pilots who flew from her deck told stories of the ocean slowly becoming safer. Destroyer captains recalled racing toward dive markers dropped by her Avengers. Merchant sailors credited her with saving their lives even if they never saw her silhouette. In museums and archives, her achievements became a blueprint for modern anti-submarine warfare. In the memories of veterans, she remained a symbol of quiet, relentless strength. And then the cold waters of the Atlantic, the same waters that once seemed to belong entirely to the wolves. The ghost of a small carrier still seems to linger somewhere beyond the horizon, cutting through the swells with wildcats roaring off her deck and Avengers diving toward the deep. The escort carrier that changed the Atlantic War forever was not a giant. She was not a titan. She was something better. A small ship with a big purpose. A turning point in steel. A hunter of hunters. A lifeline for nations. USS Bogue, the ship that saved an ocean.